So lately I've been thinking about how people are gonna react when I die.
And now to sing a song, the son of the deceased.
Friday night.
Now, it'll be one thing if I get struck by lightning while doing a do in a porta potty. And if that's the case, please laugh away. You have my full permission. It's very funny. Post the video online. I don't care. But otherwise, I'd hope that when I meet my mortal end, even my worst enemies will frown and say, you know, he had bad hair and a bad attitude, and he was really pale and kind of sickly looking all the time, but he was nice to servers, and he tipped pretty well. To him. And I don't think that's really asking for too much, because as a society, we tend to go pretty easy on people after they kick the bucket. We write musicals about famous artists while forgetting those credible accusations of child molestation. We romanticize presidents who notoriously the bed on every aspect of foreign policy, not to mention made extramarital affairs their secondary profession.
Happy birthday, Mr. President.
We made a nonagenarian playboy the champion of free speech, rather than just some guy that wanted to sell nudes of Marilyn Monroe. And yet the reaction to Henry Kissinger's recent demise was the digital equivalent of a Taylor Swift concert causing a minor earthquake. To be clear, that wasn't just a metaphor. That's a real thing that happened, by the way. Also, Swifties, I want my bracelets still. Someone said they were gonna send me one of the bracelets. I would like a bracelet. And while they weren't actually dancing on the former Secretary of State's grave, many politicians and journalists abandoned conventional decorum, resulting in headlines like Rolling Stone's Henry Kissinger, war criminal beloved by America's ruling class, finally dies.
Give me a hell yeah!
Journalist Spencer Ackerman goes on to write of the brutal Chilean dictator Kissinger's policies brought to power. Pinochet's torture chambers were the maternity ward of neoliberalism. A baby delivered, bloody and screaming, by Henry Kissinger. And to be clear, I'm not gonna be diplomatic here. I'm just gonna say it. Henry Kissinger was bad. Yep, I'm saying it. Henry Kissinger, bad guy. If you don't listen to me, Anthony Bourdain had a really good quote on that, and everyone seems to like him.
Who once said, once you've been to Cambodia, you'll never stop wanting to beat Henry Kissinger to death with your bare hands.
Now, Kissinger extended the Vietnam War for years solely to get Nixon elected. He catalyzed genocides in East Timor and Bangladesh. He illegally bombed Cambodia and Laos to smithereens. He supported violent insurgencies in southern Africa. Kissinger was basically the kid that did every extracurricular activity in high school, except that all those activities were different types of war crimes. So it's not surprising that some might feel more like hocking a loogie on his coffin than waxing poetic about his positive qualities. If you want to try to list a positive quality of Kissinger in the comments, go for it. But given the way plenty of bad dudes have been romanticized in death, it feels worth asking, why was Henry Kissinger given a uniquely harsh treatment? And for that matter, how does a society decide how to treat the dead? And do we really owe the not so dearly departed our respect? Well, let's find out in this video, is it okay to speak ill of the dead when their name is Henry Kissinger? Now, our society tends to take a gloves-on approach to death. We still invoke the old adage, don't speak ill of the dead, which historians date back to 6th century BC philosopher Chilon of Sparta, who admonished, of the dead, nothing but good. Of course, Chilon also said, gesticulation in speaking should be avoided as a mark of insanity, which is a proverb that seems to be targeting our Italian friends. So we're sorry, Italians, we're with you on this one. And we also want a bit of the pizza pie. But apart from a Spartan who hated hand gestures, humanity has long been preoccupied with the right way to treat and speak of the dead. Of course, for most of human history, dealing with dead people looked different. In ancient Egypt, elaborate death and mourning rituals weren't just for kicks, they reflected the power wielded by dead people. As historian Julia Trochet writes, the dead in ancient Egypt remained actors whose social capital could be effectively exploited within the social, religious, and political networks of the living. The living would call on the dead for help with everything from finances to fertility, and dead folks were believed to be able to combat illness and injustice. Most notably, the kings were believed to have godlike powers in death, which is why even Angelina Jolie can't get away with raiding their tombs unscathed. The worlds of the living and the dead were similarly porous in the West, in part because death was just sort of everywhere. life expectancy tapped out at around 30. Plagues could wipe out entire towns overnight, and death was just a lot more intimately familiar. I mean, not least because people usually just died in their own homes. Christianity curbed some of the associated anxiety because it viewed death less as a flashing game over sign
Snake, are you okay?
and more as a next step in the journey of your all-important soul. And the people you left behind felt a lot of responsibility for helping you along that path. As writer Kate Berridge explains, until the mid-16th century, the living believed they could influence the passage of the soul of the deceased. They acted as spiritual caretakers, and with prayers and masses, sought to hasten the soul's departure from purgatory. To that end, those who could afford to would leave posthumous endowments to fund prayers and services, or even entire chapels and designated priests to do the work for their souls. Viewed this way, honoring the dead was paramount, while bad-mouthing them risked keeping them stuck in the eternal DMV waiting room in the sky. But the same concern wasn't always extended to the dead person's body. And unless you were nobility prior to the 16th century, you were likely buried in an unmarked grave or at most given a little wooden cross. This society, like William Martin Joel knew,
It's all about soul.
the Protestant Reformation changed views of death by doing away with the Catholic concept of purgatory. And just a little, history of religion nerd cliff note here. Purgatory wasn't really biblical canon, and the Protestants were all about going by the book. Now, scholar Carlos Ayer calls this a big contributor to the secularization of society, and a significant first step towards the elevation of this world as the ultimate reality and towards the extinction of the soul. In other words, the bond between the living and the dead was extinguished. Most believe that the dead were now just gone for good, so there wasn't much reason to spend tons of time doing masses in their name. And death thus began its slow retreat from everyday life. The Renaissance had also accelerated secularization, which contributed to death's transformation. Individuals, and especially nobility, became more worried about their posthumous honor, or reputation on earth, rather than the fate of their soul. In other words, legacy became everything. The retreat of the soul and the elevation of a person's earthly legacy were both indicative of a culture that prized individuality, also the result of the Protestant Reformation and the Renaissance. Now, being dead, of course, makes it hard to be an individual, or as Carl Jung put it, all the corpses in the world are chemically identical. Your quirky sense of humor or incredible breakdancing chops thus only survive in how the living think, talk, or dance about you. And that's no small burden. As Berridge explains, the greater the celebration of individuality, the sharper death's sting has become. Loss of identity is an insupportable concept, and this is central to the compulsion to commemorate. And what better way to be remembered on Earth than through an obituary? As far back as Roman times, people in the West have written about their newly expired comrades via death notices. But this obituary, as we know it today, didn't really pop off until the mid-19th century newspaper boom. This was the Victorian era, a time of extreme sentimentalism, and obituaries captivated audiences with gruesome, tragic deathbed scenes and overdramatic lamentations of loss. One iconic example is this one. Within the short period of a year, she was a bride, a beloved wife and companion, a mother, a corpse. Yeah, you didn't see that coming, right? A real reversal at the end. It's like M. Night Shyamalan wrote that friggin' obituary. As journalism professionalized in the early 20th century, obituaries cut out weeping to give more objective, though generally positive accounts of the person's life, work, and achievements. Undergoing something of a revolution since the 1980s, obituaries have since developed more flair, panache, and opinion. Still, even in their most honest iterations, they tend to blunt unattractive truths. According to journalist Marilyn Johnson's recounting of the standard euphemisms, we all know that "he didn't suffer fools gladly" translates as a complete bastard. Gave colorful counts of his exploits, liar. Powerful negotiator, bully. Affable and hospitable at every hour, chronic alcoholic. One journalist explains the basic humanity behind this inclination. You tend to want to be kind because they're at the end of their life. You want to note the things they did that were good and the things about them that were valuable. In a secular, individualistic world where there's nothing for you after death and all you leave behind is your reputation, that approach to obituaries does seem fundamentally decent. But when it comes to figures who have wielded significant power over our world, calling a liar colorful or a bully a good negotiator has more serious implications. If you doubt that how we talk about the dead matters, consider the fact that good old Ronald Reagan's aides spent a decade preparing the 10-day-long tributes and rituals that memorialized his death in 2004. It was in a project dubbed Operation Serenade, which they called a legacy building event. You know, I just think if you die and you need a legacy building event, you probably weren't building much of a legacy, were you? The media put up little resistance covering the orchestrated commemorations, such that they seem to have emerged spontaneously and surprisingly from ordinary people. While early reporting weighed Reagan's uglier legacy, like his racist attacks on black women who received welfare, or his destruction of the air traffic controller union, against the positives of his legacy, like his sunny demeanor, all criticism quickly evaporated into slobbery admiration over the spectacle. As scholars Carolyn Kitch and Janice Hume write, what began as coverage of the ceremony sprung from political public relations became, over a week of journalism, seemingly a read on the pulse of America. A portrait of the character of the country's common folk and an assessment of their place in history. By Kitch and Hume's analysis, Reagan's own weaponization of nostalgia for a better time in the 1980s evolved into full-blown nostalgia for Reagan's presidency, effectively creating a second layer of amnesia in Americans' public memory.
It's like what you and Claudia say. They're blind to it.
Obituaries falsely revered him as the most popular president ever to leave office, who fostered Cold War might. And this doesn't reflect reality. Journalist Will Bunch notes that Reagan averaged 53% approval ratings in the Gallup poll, which made him pretty mid. And his presidency was riddled with controversies, like the Iran-Contra scandal. You just look that up. You just type into Google, Iran-Contra, and just read about it. And then let me know if you think it's good. Let me know if you think that Iran-Contra was good.
A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not.
And all that spin had political consequences. At the time, George W. Bush's administration was pleased that the tributes eclipsed negative coverage of the Iraq War, while his advisors speculated that Reagan's death would give Bush, who many saw as his tailor-made successor, a bump in the polls. I almost just made a cocaine joke about George Bush, but then I didn't, but I almost did. As Bunch writes, a generation of Reagan-era ideologues stepped into America's memory hole and reintroduced him as someone different. He was no longer an ex-actor turned great communicator following a script, but rather a political thinker and a man of God with an extraordinary character. If you ever try to step into my memory hole without permission, I'll take you out. This image rehabilitation continues to make invoking Reagan a winning strategy for Republican politicians, despite the diligent work of many YouTubers who want nothing more, I don't know, than just to remind you that a lot of the bad stuff traces back to Reagan. It doesn't mean that we're not all fervent young Republicans. It just means that if you look at some of the bad stuff now and you trace it back and you look up, you're like, oh, hello, Mr. Reagan. And he's just standing there and his pants are off. You know, that's why politics can be tough. This urge not to speak ill of even the most powerful dead people, especially by journalists who would happily criticize them in life, speaks to our general culture of compulsory sympathy for the deceased. In this way, how we discuss the dead says more about us than it does about them. Adam Smith observed this in the mid-18th century, around the time the transformation of secularization and individualization was starting to solidify. He argued, as Barrage summarizes, that a significant component of our morality is determined by the fact that the dead function as a mirror of our own mortality. Empathy for the dead is at the root of our compulsion to honor them. That is to say, we imagine we were lying in that mahogany coffin instead and worry how we would be talked about.
I don't know what to tell you, bud. We're just shooting funerals and showing the ones where the bodies fly out.
Sigmund Freud would concur, writing, "Consideration for the dead, who, after all, no longer need it, is more important to us than the truth, and certainly for most of us than consideration for the living." In this way, treating Reagan well in his death carried greater moral urgency than highlighting the people his policies had hurt. The countless black folks imprisoned for petty drug charges and war on drugs.
And by next year, our spending for drug law enforcement will have more than tripled from its 1981 levels.
Or the countless AIDS patients who suffered as Reagan's refusal to take action on, much less talk about the disease, left treatment chronically underfunded. I'm telling you, like anything, just pick a thing, and then trace it back, and you'll see Reagan. No, more importantly, we owed Reagan a decent memorial. We're good people, after all. And as Barrage writes, remembrance of the dead has metamorphosed into an important form of morality. Here, it's worth thinking about another change in how we treat death, which occurred during the 20th century. Now, death was, as we mentioned, once inescapable. As late as the Victorian age, death was memorialized in lengthy mourning rituals and elaborate bedside death ceremonies. Mourning was just a natural part of living. But especially after the First World War, the West underwent a retreat from death, whereafter mourning became shorter, more private, and more taboo. As life expectancy soared, death became increasingly absent from most people's daily existence. The process helped along with the rise of institutionalizing the elderly and the creation of the funeral industry, which sanitized and removed the trouble of dealing with the dying and the dead. Death vanished from mainstream life so quickly that some argued death and sex had flipped since the Victorian age. Death replacing sex as the ultimate taboo and sex replacing death as a constant. Also, it's just weird, like death and sex is two sort of things. I don't know, I don't like that.
Death by sex. Yeah. Sex.
While theorists have argued that the death taboo has begun to fade due to our constant bombardment of images of death in the media, these images are typically more about titillation and sensationalism rather than healthy reckonings with mortality. Now, philosopher Jean Baudrillard argued that death's retreat from daily life and the sequestering of the dead from the realm of the living robbed death of its pre-modern symbolism. Basically, back when people were closer to death and could mourn publicly and talk about it, death was seen less as an end and rather a point on a continuum of existence. Our fear of it was, according to Baudrillard, soluble. As death retreated from mainstream life, Baudrillard argued, what cannot be symbolically exchanged becomes that which haunts us. I got a death story for everyone. I think it was like at my dad's funeral. We had this reception afterwards with, drinking, snacks, things of that nature. And his buddy, he'll never watch this, John Kelly, takes me aside. He had this like Boston accent. And he was like, let me tell you something. Let me tell you something. I was like, oh boy. And he was like, a lot of guys in our business, they'd go out of town. Their wife wasn't around and they would, And he was like, but your dad, never once. Never once. And I was just like, cool. Did you tell me that because you think that I thought he was? I don't know. Shouts to John Kelly. As a result, death becomes something everyone is afraid of, but has limited experience with and limited ways to talk about. At the same time, our life expectancy has just about doubled since 1800. We all have the potential to live longer than ever. As a result, death feels like it's robbing us of time we were promised, even at 60 or 70, which would have been considered something of a mortal marathon just a few generations ago. Which is why it felt especially bad when Kissinger was rubbing shoulders at dinner parties with the elite and acting as a celebrity diplomat right up to the 100-year mark. Now, living to 100 alone, minus all the speaking gigs at Harvard perks, is privileged treatment by the fates in and of itself. The media is very obsessed with the idea of living to 100. There's all these articles about it. Now, of course, most of us, and I'm sorry for the spoiler alert here, won't make it to 100. And also, most of us aren't war criminals.
I said we don't need permissions of the family. We're allowed to show him nude because they ain't got no soul.
Which makes Kissinger's comparative luck feel especially unfair and even immoral. In an age when we're all anxious about death and unable to talk about that anxiety, and where we mostly experience death in the abstract, seeing someone as friggin' evil as Kissinger seemingly get away with it by continuing to live feels bad.
You can't keep getting away with it!
What we're really saying is if God is real, he would have already killed Kissinger. And one way to process that bad feeling is by posting about him on every available platform. Like honestly, Twitter, or X, has gotten really bad since that guy took it over. But it was a really nice evening when Kissinger died. It felt like old Twitter. Everyone just getting off their jokes, saying funny stuff. It was really beautiful. As we saw with Reagan, obituaries and media coverage of the dead are foundational to society's collective memory, with major ideological implications. As Hume puts it, societies too have the capacity to remember and forget, and this situational relevance plays a role in determining what citizens believe collectively about their history. Collective memory was once mostly influenced by the gatekeepers of the mass media. In a pre-social media age, when everyone still mostly watched the same few news networks and read the same handful of papers, the glowing treatment of a post-mortem Ronald Reagan went mostly uncontested, allowing it to manufacture a sense of collective memory that eclipsed reality. But today, the production of collective memory has changed. According to scholar Andrew Hoskins, the archive is no longer only collected and organized and managed and walled and kept by an array of institutional memory keepers. It is also diffused through a new memory ecology. The digitally fostered values of openness have driven a culture of unbridled commentary that reveals that there is no mainstream. With access to a wider assortment of information and viewpoints than ever, we're less likely to passively accept the mainstream media's polite narrative. And indeed, some media sources seem to have correctly intuited this and then just swung the whole other way. In this climate, Kissinger seems to reflect a moral fissure point. One where, if you've done so many unspeakable things, we're willing to put aside our usual decorum, where we refuse to see our own mortality reflected in the death of someone who, as a quick Google search can confirm, was truly just a fucking monster. This all makes it way harder to pull off the sort of legacy of a fallen statesman scenario we got when Reagan biffed it. And no matter how terrifying and taboo death remains for us, we're fine not treating Kissinger's with any sort of sacred reverence because he treated so many lives with hollow disregard. But maybe what matters most is that Kissinger's demise led to this glorious tweet. Shout out Liza Minnelli, you're never gonna die. So does the reaction to Kissinger's death represent a paradigm shift in how we evaluate the legacy of public figures? Or was it just an excuse to collectively rage at a pretty easy mark? Will the next bad dude's death be met with parades and glowing speeches? Or are we in a new era where whitewashing an ugly legacy is impossible? Let us know what you think in the comments. And thank you as always for being here, for clicking, for liking, subscribing. It really means a lot to us. And on that note, let me tell you, this was our last video of 2023. We're gonna take a couple of weeks off. I hope that's okay. We need to get some rest. It's been a long year. But thanks again for just being with us for another year. Because I'll be honest with you, in digital media, just managing to exist is hard and means a lot. I think every year we go into it with a little bit of worry. So just know that you have all helped keep us afloat. It means a lot to us. And we really appreciate you hanging out as we try new stuff and we change what we do a little bit. It's just the best. We got a lot of great stuff coming in 2024. We're gonna start doing some longer videos. That's pretty exciting, right? We're gonna do more streaming. That's pretty cool as well. We're gonna roll out some new Patreon features. Very fun. And then maybe hypothetically a second feed where we talk more about movies, but who knows? Either way, we just hope that you'll be there with us in 2024. We love the hell out of you, and we'll see you then. Trace it back, and you'll find yourself there with him, sitting on Reagan's lap saying, "You're not Santa, you're the opposite, because you don't give gifts. You take, and you take, and you take." Although, according to some, Nancy might have advantages over Mrs. Claus, but I've said too much.